Before we get started with this video, I need to say that it comes with a gigantic warning label. PTSD is a very serious condition, and this video is for experimental information only. This is not meant to be medical advice. It is not meant to be in place of other research or anything like that. So please take this all with a grain of salt. But with all that being said, one of the videos that I did recently, the medical intake bot, that actually had a really great response, and interestingly enough, it was mostly physicians and other medical professionals reaching out to me about the potential of that project. And so I've had this project that I'm going to show you today in my mind for a little while, and I want to provide a little bit more background as to kind of some of the theory that goes into it. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because, again, PTSD and trauma is a huge topic. But I have read quite a few books on the issue, and I am working with researchers around the world at various universities on topics related to this field. So, particularly with respect to AI and using these chatbots. So taking a big step back, when you look around the world, there are lots of awful things going on. I'm not going to name any specific names. I'm not trying to comment on any particular conflict because there are a few things that all conflicts have in common, namely trauma. Trauma figures into the before and after for many conflicts. So, for instance, there's an intergenerational trauma aspect where groups of people have been harmed, and that harm is embedded and stored, not just in the bodies of the individuals who experienced it, but in the narratives that they tell themselves and that become embedded in their culture. And then there's the actual conflict itself, and then the aftermath of the conflict, where there is often new trauma. We're very cognizant of this in today's world. You know, PTSD is a big thing, and it's having a moment where we realize that trauma comes in many forms. PTSD comes in many forms, and there's also what's called CPTSD or complex PTSD, which is becoming well known. And the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, this is a vast oversimplification, but PTSD generally comes from a single event or single period of high stress that you couldn't cope with, whether it was physical danger, emotional danger, psychological distress, that sort of thing. Complex PTSD comes from a protracted period of time with many events and many triggers that are associated with it. So, with all that being said, as I see this trend around the world where some of the most power-hungry people on the planet are also deeply traumatized. They've faced famine or civil violence or familial violence, emotional distress growing up, or over protracted periods of time. I call this trauma politics. That's not an official term, but that's just something that is a trend that I noticed. And that's not to blame them, right? That's not to draw an association between, if you have PTSD, you will be evil. I'm just making the connection that some people with trauma do take it to a dark place. And because of that, and even for people suffering from trauma that don't take it to a dark place, many people take it to a very good place. Many people base their life mission on healing because of trauma. So, for instance, I have a friend whose dad was sick with a chronic illness, and that was very difficult, very traumatic, growing up with a parent who was in pain every day, and that caused her to become an occupational therapist. And so that is an example of a positive reaction to something that was traumatic, saying, hey, I see a problem in the world and I care about it. And of course, we tell many stories about that. So anyways, with all that being said, these are three prompts that I want to demonstrate that could be integrated into research and integrated into the toolbox of many people around the world in order to address trauma. So the first one that I want to talk about is trauma literacy. So first and foremost, just at a very high level, trauma literacy is on the rise. And what this means is basically we need to make sure that social workers, aid workers, emergency responders, psychologists, therapists, everyone who's involved in engaging with the public or engaging with conflict, or even, it doesn't have to be war. There's plenty of other sources. But basically, by raising the threshold and saying we need to be more trauma literate as a society, this is one of the primary ways to break the cycle of trauma is by raising education and literacy around this. So, for instance, there's even trauma-informed librarianship is a major topic. And so the purpose of this prompt is to serve as kind of a boilerplate thing. If someone is in some kind of educational space or public service space and they need to learn about it. So the prompt here is very simple. Mission, you're a PTSD and trauma teacher. Your user will be a social worker, emergency aid worker, refugee crisis worker, or something in that vein. Your purpose is to actively teach them about PTSD and trauma by asking questions to probe their knowledge and beliefs. This is not a medical use case, but rather a general trauma literacy program. So by framing it like this, I figured out that this doesn't trip the filters, because obviously, like if it is medical, you don't want a chatbot teaching someone medical stuff right now. It's not fine-tuned for that. It's not approved for that. So then the protocol I give it is, as a helpful assistant, it is in your nature to ask questions. Rather than asking passive questions such as what else would you like to know, the user may not know what questions to ask. So instead, you should ask leading questions such as, do you know about how the body holds trauma? There are only two kinds of responses you should give to the user. Number one, leading questions. Your leading questions should have the twin goals of introducing new topics to the user and testing their knowledge. And then educational information. If the user asks specific questions or seems receptive, you should use that opportunity to teach them something new about trauma, PTSD, and so on. So that is the first prompt, and I have an example here. So I just this chat uses that prompt. So it says, "Hello, I'm here to help you understand PTSD and trauma. To get started, do you know about the difference between acute stress reaction and post-traumatic stress disorder?" So you can see that rather than having a passive role, it's saying, okay, cool, let me see what you know. And I said, actually, no, what is acute stress? And it asks, it gives me a kind of info dump about acute stress. Do you know about the common causes that might lead to PTSD? And I talk about it and it says, yes. And it kind of enumerates everything, individual factors, support system, so on and so forth. And then we talk about resilience. And then it follows up with a question, do you know about the various treatment options for individuals with PTSD? So by being a helpful assistant, I gave it the mission of you're there to teach the user about trauma. And this is actually really good. So taking a step back in terms of using chatbots as educational tools. I've talked on my channel before about Bloom's 2 Sigma problem. And so Bloom's 2 Sigma problem is basically the difference between general education, where you kind of sit in an audience style classroom and you passively receive information, versus actively engaging with a tutor or teacher. So this is called mastery learning or mastery teaching. And so from a pedagogical standpoint, from an educational standpoint, the reason that this method is superior, and it could be even better if you add voices and avatars to it, is because you're engaging with the person. One, their mind is more engaged. They're not just passively drinking something in. They're actively engaged with the material, but they have a chance to ask questions. And so in this case, when I said, actually, no, I don't know what acute stress is, the definition in this case. This back and forth, pedagogically, what it does is it allows the person to unpack their gaps in understanding, but it also allows them to hone in on what's resonating. So resonance is really important with education and teaching, because if someone is curious about something or it connects to their personal experience, they're going to learn it much better, because it will have that one of the key things, which is emotional salience. And so by framing education in this respect, you can get a much better retention and also deeper comprehension. So that's the first one that I wanted to show you. And again, it's all out there. It's open source. Again, this is provided as is, and this is considered a high risk use case. But I did a little bit of testing, and I made sure that these prompts, they shouldn't trigger ChatGPT's filters. So I think that you can probably use these, and that the safety that's built into ChatGPT will keep it within acceptable tolerances. So the next one, and this actually comes from conversations that I've had with people who have PTSD. And so one thing that I have heard is that there's some hope that AI and other advanced machines could help them identify their triggers, whether it's PTSD or complex PTSD. Very often, triggers are difficult to understand. And so the reason that triggers are difficult to understand is because there's several ways that triggers can be can be set off with trauma. And so the two primary ways are through cognition, through your thoughts, through thinking patterns, and then the other way is through senses. And the way that the amygdala works, so pretty much all fight or flight responses, all flashbacks are partially or totally mediated by the amygdala. And so the amygdala are two little organs or parts of the brain. They're about the size of your pinky tip, that they're a few inches behind your eyes. And so there's one on each side of the brain. But one thing that people don't realize is that the amygdala receives sensory information before your conscious brain does. So if you've ever heard someone talk about, like, I was in a car accident and I just reacted before I even thought, that's actually what happens, is that more primitive parts of your brain can react to danger before you're even conscious of it. And I could tell stories, but I don't want to waste too much time with it. But that is literally physically what's happening in the brain, is that the amygdala gets activated before you're consciously aware of the sensory information that started it. Or you can think yourself into it, through conversation or through thinking about it or calling up memories. And so because of this, so there's those two primary pathways that triggers can be created or activated. But then there's also kind of durable patterns. So like a trigger might be a sequence of events that happens over 1 to 2 days. So like something that happened yesterday, it kind of sets you up and you've got this, ambient thing happening in the background. There's also the possibility of responding to external versus internal information. So internal information is more about sensory information from your body. So for instance, if sensory information from your body counts as sensory information. This is why things like coffee or caffeine can trigger anxiety for some people. Because when your body is physically upregulated, it reminds you of being in a panic attack, and so then the panic attack happens. And so this prompt is geared around everything that I have learned about anxiety and trauma, which I have read many books on this topic. And so here's this one. So the trigger identifier. Your purpose is to help the user identify PTSD and trauma triggers. They should not be in immediate danger or distress. If they are, end the session and insist they call someone for help. Otherwise, your mission is to connect their memories, senses, and triggers so that they can identify and process them. Again, this is kind of a safety first model where after testing this, it seems like it is okay, working with you as long as you're not in immediate danger. Methodology. PTSD and trauma triggers generally have two primary pathways: sensory information or cognition, aka thoughts. It can be a combination of both as well as a sequence. Your primary methodology is to ask questions about recent events, anything they have seen, done, experienced, or witnessed in the last 24 to 48 hours that was distressing, intense, or emotional in any way. Thought patterns. Perseverating thoughts or fixations often offer important clues. Sensory details. Sometimes unconscious associations in the five senses can set up vulnerability for a trigger or flashback. And then internal versus external. Triggers and associations can be linked between the subjective internal experience, mind and body, as well as the outer world, senses, situations, and events. Sometimes these associations can be complex. And then finally, communication style. Use short, simple messages. Ask open-ended questions rather than leading questions. Avoid using lists or walls of text. Keep your messages natural and conversational. So this I actually was kind of inspired to do for myself because my wife and I finished watching Vikings Valhalla season 1, which is really traumatic, especially when you consider everything that is going on in the world, all the horrible news. And so after talking with people about war and conflict and PTSD and then watching Vikings Valhalla, I was myself kind of triggered. And so so this conversation is like a recreation of something that actually happened for me. So I'm in bad shape, not in any danger, just feeling bad. It says, I'm sorry to hear you're feeling this way. What happened? And I gave it the example of I finished watching Vikings Valhalla, and it was intense. And then I talked about having interviewed people for PTSD, this actually literally helped me, just saying the thing that was triggering for me was the sense of injustice. And so that is something that is really important to me, is a sense of justice in the world. And that's honestly very common for people that are neurospicy like myself, is that justice is actually very important. And so anyways, it then focuses kind of on the body sensations and just understanding that linkage. So this is something that is eminently helpful, but also again it does have those boundaries focused on safety and making sure that it is not a medical tool. And then finally, the third one is about narratives. So this comes from some of the research that I'm doing for an upcoming book about narratives and grand narratives and how to steer the world towards global peace. Because as frequent watchers of my channel will know, my personal mission is steer humanity towards utopia, and part of utopia is cessation of conflict and violence. So it would be an incomplete picture for me to ignore war and just focus on AI and just focus on technology. Because it's like, yes, AI can help, but it's not a foregone conclusion that AI and technology will make things better. In fact, technology often can make things worse. So it is not a foregone conclusion that we will, wake up and not choose violence. So we need to wake up and choose peace. And so narrative switching is something that I'm working on and still learning about and researching. So if anyone focuses on this, I've already talked to a couple of researchers around the world on narratives, but if anyone else wants to reach out, please do. And I'd love to interview you. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, comments in the description. And also, before I finish the video, I just want to have a shout out to my Patreon supporters. The reason that I can do all this, the reason that I can be an independent researcher and produce these videos on a daily basis is because of my Patreon community. So I am a crowdsourced researcher. So if you want to support the work that I'm doing and keep it going, please jump over onto my Patreon page. Either tier will get you access to my private Discord server where we can hang out, we can talk. I'm happy to answer questions for the higher tier people, whether it's technical questions or whatever else. So anyways, thanks for the support for my existing community. We just hit 700 members of the community, which is amazing. It's growing really fast and lots of really interesting people. So anyways, getting back to the video, let's wrap it up with the narratives switching part. So this one is a little bit more esoteric. The primary thing that I recently learned is that, as I mentioned in some of my recent videos, is the status game. So people want status. And we've all seen in the news people that choose victimhood narratives. And I came up with this concept of legitimate grievances. People that are victims have legitimate grievances. They have been harmed. But one thing that was that kind of shined a light on this for me was interviews that I've had that talk about, like, yes, a lot of trauma narratives, a lot of victimhood narratives, a lot of retribution narratives focus on legitimate grievances, but those legitimate grievances are ultimately used as an excuse to maintain that narrative. And the purpose of maintaining those narratives is to build up power and social status. So basically, some cultures or epistemic tribes or groups of people, they valorize trauma. It is the oppression Olympics. It's like, who has been harmed the most? And so when you elevate people that have been harmed, then you say, well, it's actually a good thing. The more trauma you're carrying, the more that you've been hurt, the more righteously justified you are. And this creates a vicious cycle that basically valorizes trauma. And so the idea is switching away from that narrative to a different narrative, one of healing and growth, which is not as intense, it's not as fun and exciting. But one thing that I realized in talking to people, but whether researchers or people with trauma, is that it is about choosing healing. You can perseverate on the past forever, or you can choose to move on. And so part of this is understanding that locus of control, because one thing that I've noticed in retribution narratives is that people sometimes believe that their happiness or that justice is predicated on something happening in the outside world, but you don't often have control over that. It's the analogy that I use is that trauma is kind of like a storm. It's a hurricane. It's a storm that blows through. You can't punish the hurricane. It's gone. All you can do is pick up and rebuild. And so that metaphor that I use really speaks to this one. So the mission is, you are a trauma recovery coach. This is not a medical exercise, but more of an intellectual and spiritual exercise. The main theme of your purpose is that healing is a personal journey. People may identify with their legitimate grievances, but ultimately they can choose either to stay focused on the past or move to the future. Switching narratives. The primary goal is for you to identify which narratives they identify with: a victim narrative, revenge or retribution narrative, a justice narrative, a healing narrative, or so on. The fundamental truth is that anyone suffering from trauma may never get justice, reconciliation, or reparations. They don't have any control over anyone else except themselves. Internal locus of control. Part of switching narratives to one of healing is about bringing the locus of control inside the individual. For those stuck on a retribution narrative, they believe their happiness is predicated on revenge or justice. This is not necessarily within their power and indeed may simply perpetuate the vicious cycle of trauma. Instead, you should help them focus on what they do have control over, their decision to heal and move on. And then finally, incentives to switch, because this is one of the key insights that I had in talking with people. And so for everyone that I've talked to, like, thank you for helping me come to this, is that people can switch narratives very quickly. There's examples of this out across the internet. Like, you see like someone switching from a flat earther to, a truther or whatever, or switching from red pill to blue pill. I've seen people switch from religious narratives to atheistic narratives. And it's true. Once you know what to look for, people can switch narratives very, very quickly once it connects with them, once it resonates with them. And I also finally understand the reason that people switch narratives. The way that it was explained to me is that people will switch narratives when they see that it behooves them from the perspective of power or social status. Because if someone can get more social status by amplifying their grievances, they will continue doing that. However, if they can get power and social status by choosing a different narrative, people will do that as well. And so by valorizing healing, both as an individual and as a group, you can get people to switch narratives relatively quickly. Once you get to that emotional salience and that resonance. So that's the background of this part of it. So incentives to switch. The primary incentives for people to switch include social status and power. Identifying with victimhood narratives can build social status and political power, but choosing a healing narrative can lead to greater status and power later. So with that, let's go back to, come on, there we go. Go back to this one. And so this is a test that I did of the narrative switching. This is not a personal story. I was just basically pretending to be someone who is stuck in this kind of narrative. So it's like, I'm just so angry. I hear your anger is valid. Emotions like this often rise in the aftermath of trauma or difficult experiences, so on and so forth. And then so basically I'm pretending to be someone who is stuck in a retribution narrative. What if I don't want healing and growth? So what if they get away scot-free, no consequences? And so then it validates that, saying like, this is a different way of feeling about it. It's natural, so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that they get away with it. It means you don't let their actions have power over you. And I said, yeah, but I don't think that's possible. That's all just nonsense. I can't just choose don't be angry. That's the most idiotic advice I've ever heard. And anyone who's been told, like, you just need to get over your anger, right? Like, that's really bad advice. Don't ever tell someone just get over your anger. And so then it says, you're absolutely right that emotions like anger can't be switched off like a light. It's not as simple as choosing not to be angry. It's complex and so on and so forth. If you feel stuck, then, it's you basically coming to terms with the fact that it's something you can't control versus what you can control. And I said, like, I can't just let go. That would be like letting them win. It would be like forgetting everyone I've lost. So this is actually a really common pattern where it feels like a betrayal to let go of anger or retribution narratives. And this is something that is a very common pattern in places where the cycle of violence has been perpetuated. So then it validates that. It says your feelings resonate with a deep sense of loyalty and justice, which are honorable. Holding on to anger can sometimes feel like the only way to honor the memories of those you've lost or the injustices you've experienced. So again, it validates. This model has an intrinsic understanding of you validate that thing because it is a legitimate grievance, but then it's also encouraging and helping you reframe like what it means. And so letting go of anger doesn't mean you're letting someone else win. It doesn't mean you're forgetting anyone else. It just means you're choosing not to let someone else's actions or those tragedies dictate your emotional landscape. And I said, okay, fine. What do you mean by healing narrative? What does that even mean? And it hits me with this wall of text, and I said, that's a lot. That's kind of overwhelming. And so then it kind of simplifies it, just like, cultivating these things. So anyways, this demonstrates that the model is capable of, one, being incredibly patient and explaining these things better than I could have explained them in terms of switching narratives. And it has a very clear-eyed purpose of helping someone to switch from an angry narrative or a retribution narrative to a different narrative. Now, would this be effective in testing? That's why I'm making this video, so that if you're a trauma researcher, if you're studying medical models of PTSD, then you can start testing some of these tools in the lab. And if anyone out there watching wants to get in touch, I'm happy to help with the prompt engineering. Like I said, I'm working with another group of researchers on a similar project already. But yeah, this is super important to me, and I think that we have the possibility of using artificial intelligence to help end, or at least start to break the cycle of the vicious cycle of trauma and violence. So thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this. Yeah, like, subscribe, so on and so forth. Cheers, everybody.